we've got, we'll kind of start on our left over there, their right. We have Norm Thurston representing District 64, and Mark Roberts representing District 67. They're both representatives. We have Senator Deidre Henderson representing District 7. And then we have Representative Mike McKell representing District 66, and then Representative Francis Gibson representing District 65. We're going to go ahead and allow them 1 minute each to do just kind of an introduction. And so we'll go ahead and start on, Norm, we'll start with you and just move in the same direction we introduced you.
I don't even know what to say. I'm like so tired. It's been a good week. So there's a lot of stuff happening. I think you're going to hear the big issues, of course, tax reform, and that's the other end of the table. We'll let Tim talk about that. I think we've just, it's been an amazing year this year compared to the year previously in terms of collaborative. The House seems to be working really well together, working on resolving hard issues and having policy debates and stuff moving forward. I don't know, it's just 9 days to go, and I'm going to be amazed to see how much stuff we can get done. So it'll be exciting, and I do enjoy hearing from everybody. So I want to leave time for questions, not talk too much. So pass it off to her and Roberts.
Thank you. Representative Roberts, I don't have time to say either. Thank everybody for coming. It's nice to see the turnout. It's early. I don't know who decided 7:30, by the way, but I'm starting to question that right now. But happy to be here. I think Norm's right. It seems like it's been a decent session so far, but we got a lot of work to do and big things to take care of the next week and a half here.
Senator Deidre Henderson. It's the end of week 5. We've got 2 more weeks to go, just under 2 weeks, and I think we're all feeling it, and everybody, probably everybody in this room too, is excited for the legislative session to just be over. I've got a number of my bills already through the process. The rest of them are now in the House. Working on a lot of transparency issues, as usual, which I've been told is very boring, but I think very important. Anyway, I'm excited to be here and answer questions later.
Thank you, Representative Mike McKell, and it's good seeing all of you again. You can sense a little fatigue in the legislature at the end of week 5. I mean, we go from early morning to late at night. I drive home every night, and it's been a lot of work this session. I think compared to what it was 7 years ago when most of us here started, and Francis was here before that, the workload has gotten harder and harder. But it's good to be here, and we're happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
I don't know why you guys are tired. I'm just so happy and excited and energetic. It's a great day. It's a good day to be here. The 2 things the House, and I think from a House perspective, I served as the majority of the year. The 2 things we really wanted to address this year was being able to cap our costs and understand the cost of the Medicaid program, and then it's the Medicaid expansion, and then tax reform. And that's one of the things we'll talk about today. I know Carrie's going to introduce Representative Tim Quinn, who drove in from Midway. If you think it's snowing here, you can imagine what it was to get through Cocaine and be here. I really appreciate that he came here today, and he is pretty sharp when it comes to tax policy, and we're going to learn a little bit more about that today. And so, thank you for being here. Our numbers are a little bit down, but weather, and I know that there's several athletic events going on in St. George. Thanks people in there as well, but we're glad you're here.
Thank you for allowing me to spend a little bit of time with you this morning. I would thank Francis or Representative Gibson for the invite, but I'm not going to. Let me first start off by just spending a few minutes explaining the why we feel like something needs to be done. Most of you have heard, probably all of you have heard, we have a surplus in the state of Utah in revenue. It was originally set at $1.3 billion. It's now been decreased a couple of $100 million, but we still do have a surplus, or more appropriately referred to as unappropriated funds. The problem with that is the vast majority of that, 85+%, is in the income tax side. That is dedicated solely to education. The general fund, which is all driven by sales tax, there wasn't much of a surplus, and we're already, if I had my slideshow, and I apologize, I couldn't pull it up in here this morning. We're already a negative $64 million in that fund, and as Speaker Wilson said yesterday to the school superintendents, he has a folder on his desk with $700 million more requests that are not funded, and we're already a $64 million deficit. In the general fund, we pay for everything that we do in government except education primarily. The courts are funded through the general fund, prison construction through the general fund, social services, including Medicaid, which was just passed in the state of Utah, is funded through the general fund. Much of our road construction is funded through the general fund. If you think of what government does outside of education, most of it occurs in the general fund. And that's where our problem is. We do not have a revenue problem in the state of Utah. But we do have a problem with where that money comes from. Because we cannot shift money out of the income fund, the education fund, and move it over to the general fund, except as it applies to higher education. Back in '96, the people voted the Constitution to change so that it would allow higher education to be funded out of the education fund. And that gets a little confusing sometimes, but the education fund was set up for K through 12 funding, not higher ed. But in '96, we started making shifts, or the legislature started making shifts. At the time, $700 million roughly was still being funded out of the general fund for higher education. This year, that number is down to $300 million, and next year it will be zero. There is no money left to shift out of the general fund to higher education. So a lot of people in the education community said, wait, if on this tax reform you're lowering the income tax rate from 4.95 to 4.75, that's going to hurt education funding. We can talk in just a moment of why it won't, but my response is we're already cutting your funding. Whether we touch the rate or not, we're already cutting your funding. Next year, we're going to cut 11% out of WPU. And their eyes get big, and they go, what? And I said, well, think about this. This year, we took $1 billion from you for higher education, and next year, we're going to take $1.35 billion from you. That's a $350 million cut to education. That equals 11% of WPU that otherwise would be there. So that's why we think we need to do something structurally to our tax code system so that we can stabilize the general fund and start seeing an increase in that account. Now, why is it that way? What's changed over the years? We've changed from a goods economy to a service economy primarily. Back in 1998, I think as the chart says, the state of Utah received 41% of its revenue from income taxes and 41% of its revenue from sales taxes. Today, those numbers are 52% from income taxes and 31% from sales taxes. We don't buy stuff anymore. Some of the examples I like to use, when I was growing up, if I wanted to listen to music, I bought an album or an 8-track. And we pay sales tax on that. Today, when my kids want to listen to music, they subscribe to some service, Spotify or something. There's no tax on that. When I was growing up, my dad and every dad on the street bought a lawnmower, paid taxes on that lawnmower. Today, one dad buys a lawnmower and he mows the other 99 dads' lawns. No sales taxes on that. So multiply that times hundreds and hundreds of activities that we used to purchase on the goods side that we now purchase on the service side. And maybe it will give you a clue as to why we're such a change in the economy and why that disparity is occurring between the income revenue and the income tax revenue and the sales tax revenue. So that's just an overview of why. Now what? What did we do? We've been looking into this almost a year now and working with legislative fiscal analysts, working with legislative research and public policy analysts and say, what is the best route for Utah to go? We were just told 2 or 3 days ago that Utah is, for the 11th year in a row, the best fiscally managed state in the country. What do we do to make sure that we stay consistent with that ranking? We've been down many roads. We've thought we had a policy in place that made sense, and then we would open a door and realize that there was some unintended consequence to that bill. What we've settled on is an expansion of the sales tax base to include many, many services in our society. I won't go into the weeds about NAICS codes and how we distinguish different industries in our economy, but we've tried to touch every major industry group, every major sector of the economy, including healthcare, in what I consider a very, very small way. I'll give you some examples. So If we broke the economy out into about 20 different sectors, healthcare, construction, retail, manufacturing, wholesale, education, there's about 20 of them. In many of those areas, we went in and just grabbed everything because we wanted to broaden this base as fairly as we could and not pick winners and losers in the state. I think when we start micromanaging who's going to have to charge a tax and who doesn't, then that's centralized government, and I'm not in favor of that. So we wanted to broaden this base as wide as we could, while being sensitive to a couple of areas. One of those is healthcare. Most of us would agree in this room, like everybody here working for a hospital, that we have a crisis in affordability in healthcare. And I don't know whose fault that is. It probably is a bunch of people's fault, but certainly healthcare has become more and more expensive in the last decade or so. So instead of charging transaction fees every time you go into the hospital or a doctor or surgery or whatever, and you get charged a tax on that, that didn't make any sense to us. So we just very softly reached in and said, okay, maybe one way we could solve this problem is to just charge a 1% excise tax on medical insurance premiums. Every other insurance premium that we have in the state is taxed at 2.25%. Medical insurance is the only one that isn't. That would raise $66 billion, which is, and I know that sounds like a lot of money, and it is, but not in relationship to everything else that we do in the state. There are some other ideas floating around. Representative Dunnigan and I are, he's working with me to see if there's another solution, so we may not even do the excise tax, but that's just an example. The other is housing. We have an affordability crisis in housing. It's tough for our kids as they move out and graduate and get their first jobs to, or even their second or third jobs to afford a home. But again, we didn't want to leave that industry out. So we've done some things inside of that. Keep in mind that right now, currently about 30% of a home is already being taxed at the construction stage. We tax the bricks and sticks, the bricks, the lumber, the sheetrock, the roofing supplies, everything, all the materials that go into the building of a home comprises about 30% of that home's price. We're taxing that currently on the state level. I want to talk about state rates, not the locals, but on a state rate, 4.7%. Well, if we're lowering that rate all the way down to 3.1, that reduces the cost of that house on an average home in Utah a little over $2,000. Well, we didn't want to leave the housing industry out, so we added a few items to the cost of a home that we were going to tax to bring it up to parity or a little more. And then we've charged what I felt was, or the working group felt like, was the most transparent and simple way to tax that service, and that was to put a transfer tax of 0.00075 to the transfer of a house, or real estate, I should say. That includes commercial buildings. On a $400,000 house, that equates to $300. Utah is one of only 13 states in the nation that doesn't have a transfer tax currently. And if we do enact this, it'll be the lowest by far rate of anybody in the country. Now I say that not to say just because another state does it, we should. But many times in this process, people have said, well, what are other states doing? Why have they not gone down this path? So I was just giving you an example. Other states have done this. And then in other areas, we've chosen to go into those sectors and pull in most providers of services to tax them. So instead of getting in the weeds, let me give you the overview. So we're currently 4.7% of the state rate. That rate will drop to 3.1%. So everything that you've been buying, that you've been paying sales tax on since the 1930s, will be reduced. I think that figure comes out to close to a 40% reduction. On the income tax side, we've lowered the rate from 4.95 to 4.75. That's not only for personal income taxes, but also corporate income taxes. In doing that, that's made the bill revenue neutral. We do not get any more dollars into the state. This policy is not designed, nor would I let it be designed with my name on it, to have more revenue come to the state. This is just a shift of where the taxes are coming from because of the constitutional requirement or restriction on the income tax fund. We did an incidence of tax to say, what does this do to the typical Utah family? We wanted to make sure that we weren't missing something. The typical Utah family, believe it or not, is a 31-year-old head of household with 3.1 members of the family, not 3.1 children, but 3.1 members of the family. I found that hard to believe because I have 8 kids. I have 24 grandkids, so I thought, how in the world is that typical? But it statistically is. And that typical family makes just above $65,000 a year. So with that typical family in mind, we ran an analysis of what they pay currently in taxes, both sales and income, and what would they pay under this bill. And to that typical Utah family, they would save $634 a year in taxes. That would be a decrease to them. We understand that there are some people who would pay a little more, people who spend more of their, as a percentage of their income, more on services. We could go into some of those. The governor likes to talk about cosmetic surgery and limos. Those are good sound bites, but that's not the reality. We would be taxing a lot more services than that, and many of those services are services that you and I use. But for a typical family, this saves $634. We think, I'll rephrase that, I think this is sound policy. It prepares us and will carry us through, I believe, for the next couple of decades. And just real quickly, I mentioned yesterday in my presentation, for the first 45 years of my life, for the first 40 years of my life, not much changed in technology. Now we went from rolling down windows to a button that raises and lowers them in our car. We made conveniences more convenient. But from a technology standpoint, there wasn't the advances that we've seen in the last decade or decade and a half. So to try to think forward a decade, or to think forward 15 years and say, what will come about next? It's mind-boggling for me what the possibilities might be. So when we drafted the bill, we didn't draft it in a way that says this is taxed, and this is taxed. We drafted and said this is not taxed, this is not taxed, and this is not taxed. So as new technologies come, as new business platforms come, as disruptive platforms come to the business sector of the economy, it'll automatically grab those services and tax them. And as we do so, that general fund will continue to grow so that over the years, that funding that we've been taking out of the education fund for higher education will be pushed back into the general fund where it was intended to be, and then education can fund K through 12 where it was supposed to be. And over time, not only keep them harmless, but actually restore some of the funding that they feel like they've lost since the recession that hit. So I could go on for days really, but I don't want to and you don't want me to, so I'll leave it there, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Yeah, so if it's okay, but I've got a question, it's just the third one down, I'll just grab that one and go with that, and that's going to be this one. So House Bill 308, talked about this in the past, there are attorneys, including one in Utah County, that will go and sue every possible business they can for an ADA violation, and then they'll shake you down for a settlement. House Bill 308 tries to address that. Right now, I'm in negotiations with the Supreme Court justices and the Bar Association to figure out how we can do this in a more effective way. And we will have a report from them at our hearing on Tuesday. So they're going to come and report to the committee on Tuesday as to what they recommend that we do. And if they come and they say they can't solve it, then we'll move forward with the bill. If they say they can solve it, then we'll let them have a year to solve it and see what happens.
Thank you. Representative Roberts.
Thank you. I guess I'll talk about two pieces of legislation real quick. One is called domesticated game slaughter. We've been working with, I can't remember if I talked about this the last time, but it passed out of committee yesterday. It's going to the House floor. You've got people across the state who raise bison and elk, and it's hard to get these bison and elk to the slaughter facilities. You can't move bison like you can move cattle. They don't like to move. And we had a representative who raises bison, and he got bored, almost killed him by his own bison. So you can go out in the field and slaughter these in the field now, then haul them back dead to the processing plant, cut and wrap it there, and then there's a process through which you do this, and now you can put those products into grocery stores or sell them to restaurants and different things like that. Industry's really excited about it, and a number of people who raise these animals. So that passed out of the House committee yesterday. Worked pretty hard with the department on it, Farm Bureau, some other local agriculture folks on it. Also have another bill called Regulatory Sandbox. Like Representative Quinn talked about, technology is changing quite rapidly. There's been a trend really around the world, and it's finally coming to the U.S. on fintech, financial technology, regulatory sandboxes, where it creates this environment for technology companies to go in and test out their products on a limited basis, limited scale, with some oversight, without having to adhere to some of the egregious and very onerous licensing and regulatory requirements that are in place, because some of the new innovative technology that's coming out doesn't quite fit in any of the regulatory boxes. And so it's either really expensive for these companies to figure out how to do legally what they're supposed to do, or if it even fits or not. And so they can make an application to the Department of Commerce, explain what they're doing. The Department of Commerce can work with them, give them a limited time to test out their products, 2 years in the marketplace, with some oversight, and that they can waive certain licensing requirements or regulations on those, for whatever it is they're trying to do, and work with them to test their products out in the market and help them towards licensure. Or from the state level, we can learn, hey, where does this actually fit? Do we have a gray area in our code? Do we need to adjust some things to help with this new emerging technology? So that will pass out of the House committee on Wednesday, and will be on the floor next week.
Thank you. Senator Henderson.
Thank you. I've got a couple of bills that I think are really important that are now in the House waiting for a hearing. One of them is Senate Bill 151, which is Initiative Procedures Amendment. So we've got these statewide initiatives. We saw several of them on our ballot last year. And these initiatives are often the funding source of how these policies are going to be enacted and paid for aren't usually addressed in these initiatives. So what my bill does is say, you know what, we've got to address where the funding is going to come from. For example, Proposition 3 did have a funding source attached to that. That was the Medicaid expansion initiative, and there was a tax increase included in that to pay for it. So my bill says that when there's a statewide initiative, there needs to be an analysis, a financial impact analysis done that includes where the funding is going to come from, whether it's the general fund or the education fund or a new tax. And that impact analysis, that financial impact analysis, currently is done by the Governor's Office of Management and Budget, which is, while the person who's there may be really great and wonderful, it is a partisan place. And so my bill moves that over to the Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office, which I think is the appropriate place for some financial impact analysis to be done. They do it on all of our bills. They do it in a nonpartisan way. Their job is to make sure they get the numbers right, not to skew them one way or the other for political reasons. And so that's what my bill does. It also does another really important thing. A few years ago, we ran a bill that required local governments, when they put a bond question on the ballot, to have that cost of that bond be upfront. So we're doing the same thing with the initiatives. We want the cost to be transparent. We want it to be upfront, so that when the voters go and to the ballot box, or they're reading through their vote by mail, they can see upfront, not buried clear down at the bottom, how much the initiative is going to cost the taxpayers of the state. It actually passed unanimously in the Senate, and I was a little bit surprised by that. I thought that maybe the Democrats will, on second reading, we vote everything twice in the Senate. And the first time, all the Democrats voted no on it. And then I went and talked to them and explained, the benefits of financial transparency, and they agreed, and they ended up voting for it on third reading. So that one got bipartisan support, which I was a little bit surprised and happy about. Another bill that I'm working on, I'm the Senate sponsor of it. It's a House Bill 250, deals with school fees. Last year, there was a school fee audit, a legislative audit that came out that showed some interesting problems with school fees, secondary school fees especially. We allow secondary schools, if any of you had a high school student, gone to sign them up for classes and get the bill. It's maybe a little bit of a sticker shock when you get the bill. So there was an audit on all of those, and one of the surprising things to me in that audit was the notion that school fees, according to a court injunction in 1994, school fees are supposed to be waivable even if it's an elective activity, if it's not like the science class or something that's required, even if it's just some kind of an elective, a choir, or sporting activities. Those all have to be waivable according to this court order. And we've been kind of ignoring that. Well, not kind of, we have been ignoring that for the last couple of decades. And so what this bill does, it says that schools have to waive fees for everybody. And the problem has been that the school fees, the growth rate of the school fees has far exceeded inflation. And we're kind of getting out of control. And that's actually limiting a lot of kids' ability to participate fully in activities. And we can talk more about that in detail later if anyone has a question on that.
Okay, thank you.
Let me just cover two items. One is actually a funding item that's a priority for me, and I'm going to mention it here because I'm going to lobby my colleagues at the exact same time. So this is a funding request for Woodland Hills. Mayor Craig, put your phone down. We have requested $650,000 for Woodland Hills. We know what happened with the disasters. They need to purchase some ground to build a retention basin. It's significant. There is an additional funding request. I know Representative Gibson Francis is working on that through Utah County, but that has been a priority. And I bring it up because in the final 9 days we're looking at budgets. It's on the list right now. I'm hoping my colleagues will listen to me and keep it on the list. I think it's incredibly important. In that light as well, passed a bill, post-disaster recovery mitigation. That's now going to Senator Henderson to carry in the Senate. We need a fund for locals. When there's a disaster, during the disaster itself, the government steps in and the state steps in. Post-mitigation, there's nothing for the locals. We actually limit cities and counties from saving too much money. We let them save 25% of their budget. And the reason for that is we don't want our taxes to inflate to a point where they're collecting money and having large surpluses. With that said, Woodland Hills has a budget of $1 million, give or take, and coming up with $650,000 is impossible. So I've got a bill put together creating a restricted account for what comes after flood, fire, earthquake, mudslide, soil problems. So that's now to Senator Henderson over in the Senate. We have to get that passed. So that.
That's for all cities.
For all cities and counties, without Albert Francis. Thank you, but colleagues, keep that on the list, please.
And I'm just going to hit some of the questions up there. Number one is, looks like 23 people want to talk about it. House Bill 288 and gravel pits, and why did I vote for it? Yep, I did vote for that. Whenever there's a pig farm out in the middle of the field, and a lot of people move around it, and they say, well, this stinks. Pig farm's got to move. Well, the pig farm was there first. And it's a property rights issue for me. A lot of the gravel pits, they were there. And cities are starting to encroach upon them as we develop and as we move. There are some gravel pits and owners of companies that are very good, but we also have some bad actors as well. I look at the costs of what it takes to continue to build. We are growing everywhere. And the thought of us putting gravel pits out in the area where no one longer leaves, we will see an increased cost in terms of transportation costs to get those road-based materials, concrete materials, whatever it takes to build those critical infrastructure things, to get them closer to the place where they're being built. I realize that there's one in Lakeshore or West Mountain. Apparently that's giving Representative McKell some consternation and some other people. But I also look at the bigger picture, what's going on with property rights. And these people have the property, they should be able to do this. I also know that Representative Quinn had no fewer than 50 different meetings with I'm sorry, Logan Wild. Representative Quinn's always on my mind these days. Representative Wild has sponsored this bill. I know he had over 50 meetings. I participated in a few of them myself with different communities, different stakeholders in this bill. And continually, he would continue to adjust the bill, adjust the bill, address the bill, change it, make it better, change it. And I saw people time and time again, in good faith, try to negotiate this bill someplace where they could get it, only to stand up and oppose it after he made the changes that were requested. So when it says, why did I vote for it? That's why I voted for it. It continues to be something that's important. It is critical, and we are continuing to grow, and so for that matter, that's why I support it. There's another bill that was up there, that was one of the top ones that looks like it may have fallen a little bit, but I wanted to talk about the Utah Inland Port. I don't have a lot of bills this year. That is one that I'm carrying again this year, and it said, why is it to take away local control for cities, the ability to sue the Utah Inland Port? I've actually met with the city council, and their ability to sue is there as long as the governing body or the legislative body of that community. So in this case, Benchwork, for example, Mayor Leeson just couldn't go off and decide to sue. He would need a vote of his council to be able to sue. And to use public funds, if the council voted to do that, that ability would be there. So there is the ability to sue the Utah Inland Port, but it has to be approved by the governing body or the legislative body of that community. In a city of this size, it would be the city council having permission to do that, and not just the mayor going off and doing it his or herself. So,
Thank you.
if the number 2 question up there that seems to ask about, I'm going to loop our guest into this because I think it's relevant to him. And the question was, why were realtors exempted from the sales tax or from the tax? And are they that influential on Capitol Hill's number 2 on the board there? I've already read it to him since he doesn't have his glasses with him, but I think he gets the gist of the question.
If you want to answer it, why don't you answer it? There were several reasons, but the one I think that was most compelling to me, because they were originally in. When we started drafting the bill, they were originally in. I used to, for 23 years of my career, I did lending, residential lending all across the country. We operated in 35 states. And once I started going down the path, I realized that we charge the sales tax to the realtors. I know who's going to pay that. It's going to be the people buying homes. The problem with it was you can't lend to a tax. So that would require more cash at the closing table for everybody that bought a home. Whereas a transfer tax, that's lendable. A mortgage company will include that as part of the closing costs, so it doesn't change the number that a borrower has to bring in cash at the closing table, whereas a tax would. That was the primary reason.
That includes appraisers?
Does what include appraisers? The tax on the appraisal?
Because of the loan.
My first glance at that, because I've never had that issue raised, my first glance at that is no, that would not.
It should. We still, on House Bill 288, that was addressed to more than Representative Gibson. Does anybody else want to comment on that, or did you cover it?
Just briefly, I'll just let you know, I was receiving communications almost every day from Provo City Council, and I voted the way Provo City Council suggested that they wanted me to vote. So maybe that's a message to other cities. I'm happy to listen to any city, but I feel very strongly about local control, and when my city council chair called me and said, we're okay with the current version of 288, you can vote for it, feel good about it. And I said, that's great, I'll vote for it, feel good about it. So that's a short answer, but that's what happened.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Like Representative Gibson said, that this bill went through a number of iterations from where it started to where it ended up. If you notice, our bills up there says HB 288, but we passed second substitute HB 288, which means 2 whole different versions of the bill were printed and drafted. That doesn't include all the iterations in between those times. So it changed quite a bit. But at the end of the day, for me, it's what Representative Gibson, I will always fall on the side of property rights. And we got to protect property rights, whether it's a gravel pit, whether it's a meat farm, whether it's a dairy farm, whether it's a housing operation. In my view, we have to protect property rights, and I think this bill finds a decent balance for that.
And let me address why I didn't vote for it. So I have watched this fight in West Mountain for years and years and years. Kilgore is a company that concerns me. I'll be very, very clear. I watched the fight. Staker Parsons was a very, very good neighbor. The orchards were concerned about dust. Staker Parsons mitigated. Clyde Company out there, I've watched them, they've been fantastic. I know when Clyde Company and Staker Parsons reached out to Kilgore, Kilgore basically said, back off, stay out of our business, and used a string of expletives. I was in a public meeting out in West Mountain with residents actually complaining about Kilgore. Hey, they don't stop at our stop signs, they don't do this, they don't do this, they don't do this. While we were sitting in the city, at the meeting itself, I watched 2 Kilgore trucks back-to-back run stop signs in front of a group of 50 residents. I think there is a very, very bad actor out there. I don't think they've been responsive to West Mountain. and that's why I didn't support it. I will say, it was second substitute. I sat next to Logan Wild on the House floor. The bill that he passed out was much, much better. It would include local control and a local entity. So for the case of West Mountain, it would have to be Utah County that would vote on that. And Utah County has been very, very active with Commissioner Ivey. One of the concerns, I know we talk about property rights, that gravel pit and that operation is being expanded far beyond the scope of what it was originally designed to be. And that is the concern, and you've got a lot of folks that came there long before those rights have been expanded. So I look at those property rights, but it does concern me that the local rights have been ignored as they've continued to try to expand. So I voted against that. I think there's very good actors, but what I've seen is there was one very bad actor, and I'm not going to reward him.
Looks like the next question up there is, where do you stand on the pari-mutuel betting bill, Rule of Constitution 1927?
So can I take that? So I race horses, and I'll be the first one to admit that, and I'm very open about it. Our Utah Supreme Court has ruled that pari-mutuel betting is not a form of gambling. I'm not going to explain that ruling, but they did rule in 1927 that it is not a form of gambling. So Senator Hinkins has a bill that would allow local counties to put pari-mutuel on the ballot. What that would mean is no more than every 2 years a local county could put that on the ballot. Unfortunately, Mayor Wright's track and pacing is gone, so I don't foresee this as an issue in Utah County, but there are tracks across the state. We had more than 500 horses run last year. I support the bill. If Senator Hinkins can get it out of the Senate, I'm going to be the floor sponsor. We have an entire industry that we've held back for decades and decades. For many of the older folks here, remember going to county fairs, going to the track and basin. These were big community events that continue to evaporate. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's right. And I'm going to give one shout out, Kevin. You sponsor the rodeo in Spanish Fork. I sponsor the rodeo in Spanish Fork. And the group that sponsors barrel racing is McCauley Land and Livestock. And last year, 2018, they were the third winningest quarter horse breeder in the entire country. We have an industry, we're holding it back, we shouldn't, so I support it. So great question for whoever asked that. I saw lots of little thumbs, so I'm glad we got to talk about it.
And I got skipped, so I'm going to jump in.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I'm gonna jump in though. I saw a question on the board. It is not at the top. It's clearly at the bottom now, but I saw it, so I'm going to answer it. It's Senate Bill 26. Someone asked where that was, why it's being stalled in the House. It's a good bill. There was a good article in the Salt Lake Tribune about it, which really, I don't know, never happens. Salt Lake Tribune doesn't typically like my stuff. But anyway, that bill is not stalled now, and it's a good, Representative Roberts mentioned how House Bill 288 is on the second substitute, and how sometimes a bill is introduced in its original form and it might get a bad reputation, but the end product isn't necessarily bad or have some of those concerns in it. And Senate Bill 26 is similar to that. So that it's a transparency bill. It was the result of a legislative audit that showed we've got government nonprofits in the state of Utah that are not adequately controlling their finances, and they don't have separation of duties. There are a lot of board governance problems, and so this bill is a result of that, to try to have the state auditor to provide some training to board members on these government nonprofits. They deal with taxpayer money and should be adequately trained, and many of them are not currently. And so that bill actually did end up passing a House committee earlier this week. It'll be heard next week, I imagine, in the House chamber. And it passed unanimously. I was able to take some of the feedback that I got from stakeholders, which was really an interesting process, an important process, and help to resolve their concerns. And now the Utah Association of Nonprofits supports the bill.
Okay, thank you. Looks like our next question is, I don't want Utah to become California. Where does the bill on banning plastic bag regulations stand?
Does that mean I get that one? So on the House floor last year, the good representative to my far left actually represents Park City. We have two cities that have created bans on plastic products, Park City and Moab. I have a bill, House Bill 320, and that would ban cities from creating plastic bans. The reason that's important, I'm going to give you an example of a bill Senator Henderson, I'm going to pick on you. Senator Henderson has been running bills dealing with food trucks, which seems like an interesting issue. And the concern is with food trucks is we go from Spanish Fork, which has good rules, to cities like Moab, who may not have bad rules, to cities like Provo, who may have good rules, to cities like Warrenburg, may have bad rules. And we create a patchwork of regulation across the state. And with items, with plastic items, with franchisors, there is a need to have consistency across the state. You've got a patchwork of regulation. We've seen that in California, where we go, here's our rule in this city, here's our rule in this city, here's our rule in this city. It's interference in business. I know the League of Cities and Towns doesn't like the fact that I'm asking for preemption. I know they like the fact they think that it's good for cities to have different carve-outs and different rules. I don't think it's good for the economy. I don't think it's good for business. So I've got a bill. It's sitting on the third reading calendar in the House, but that's what it is. It is banning bans and letting consumers and businesses make that decision. I give the example of Trader Joe's. Trader Joe's uses renewable bag. I think that's fantastic, but that's their choice for their customers, and I want to see consistency in the marketplace. So that's what that is, the ban on bans.
All right, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I would.
This is from Park City, by the way.
As long as you can tax it.
I live in Heber, not Park City. Representative McHale failed to tell you that last year when this bill did come up, it was defeated 14 to 58.
It was a Senate bill.
Even close. So I'm not sure why he's motivated to bring it back again, except maybe to help me because I have to give you that.
Giving you a plastic water bottle in Spanish Fork.
We use a phrase up at the Capitol quite often that cities are political subdivisions of the state, and that is true. However, I don't believe that we ought to be such a centralized government that the state regulates something as insignificant in many cases as a plastic bag. Now, certainly there are things that cities shouldn't be allowed to do without statutory authority from the state, such as tax. We give the cities the ability to tax their citizens or to put up for a vote a certain levy tax that they can decide for themselves. But if we can't even let them decide whether to ban something as small and insignificant as a plastic bag, then why do we have the cities in the first place? So to me, this is not about the plastic bag. I told in my debate last year with this, I better not say that, should I? With this representative to my right, I told the city of Park City, I think your ban is dumb, but I think you have the right to be dumb as a city. So I'm going to fight for that right as local control.
We're going to have a good debate this year, too. We used to sit next to each other on the House floor.
And this is why we don't.
All right, thank you. Representative Quinn, it looks like you're not going to get off too easy again. There's a follow-up question that's getting a lot of support. Your response to the relative sales tax exemption was largely based on costs being passed on to consumers. Aren't all sales taxes passed on to consumers?
Yes, and if I explained it that way, then I apologize. That was not my comment. I thought, yes, all taxes are passed on to consumers, and that's an important part of this bill. I've had a lot of industry say, we work on small margins. If we have to pay a 3% or whatever, 3.1% tax, that's going to crush my margins. We're not taxing industry, we're taxing those who use that industry services. So yes, all taxes are passed along to consumers. My point was that if we tax the average home price and the average commission price, that's $24,000. If we tax that on the state level, that's, my quick math, was that $720 additional money that a borrower has to bring to closing in cash, as opposed to being lended through the transfer tax, which is $300 on that same house that can be borrowed. That was the difference. Not who it affects. Both of them affect the consumer, but one affects the amount of money they have to bring to closing. And most people are very, very limited with what they can bring to closing. So if they have an additional $720, that reduces the amount of house that they can afford. So it's not who pays it, it's how it's being paid.
Thank you. All right, looks like our next question that's most popular is how much will House Bill 441 cost small businesses to implement?
Again? We had it in our committee yesterday. By the way, the bill passed 12 to 2. out of committee yesterday. One of the questions from Representative Ivory was that very question, how much would it cost small businesses? We asked John Valentine, the Commissioner of the Tax Commission, to come up and testify to that or to answer that question. He said it's hard to say what it would cost an individual small business because so many businesses are different. What is the definition of small? But he went through the process of what it takes to create an account with the online system. He went through what it takes to file those tax reports, and he said this should not have any significant cost to small businesses to do. One of the legislative fiscal analysts, the director of the legislative fiscal analysts, he has an 11-year-old daughter who makes jewelry and sells it at these small, county fairs and city events, city markets. She even files her sales tax report. So if an 11-year-old can do it, I think that most small business owners without much difficulty can do it.
If I can jump in here too, it's my understanding that businesses actually get a little, the 1% or 1.5% or something. Yeah, 1.3%. I don't know if you call it a rebate or anyway, they get some of that money back to help cover the cost of compliance.
So I'm going to just pick that question. I think it's the very bottom question, but somehow it's on the top page, so I'm going to go with that one. When can I start buying cheaper drugs from Canada? I think some of you remember last year I had a bill proposing to allow us to seek permission from the federal government to bring those cheaper drugs from Canada into Utah and sell in our local pharmacies. That bill passed the House on a vote of 63-6. It's now in the Senate. Senator Bramble is my enthusiastic Senate sponsor, and hopefully he will get that across the finish line for us. And the great thing about that bill is all it says is, let's ask the federal government the question, can we do this? And if they say no, we're not out anything. If they say yes, you may be able to start buying some of the drugs that you are spending thousands of dollars on, or that your health plan is spending thousands of dollars on, at prices that are much less than half of what we're currently paying. People say, who's fighting against this? And there's only one answer. It's pharma. It's the manufacturers. I haven't had really any serious resistance by anybody except people who are either pharma or who pharma is paying to resist this. And it's amazing to find out who is being paid by pharma. It's quite an eye-opener. I see these lists of people who oppose the bill, and you go back and see where their money's coming from. And it's just eye-opening to see how much influence the pharmaceutical manufacturers have in a lot of different areas. They spend a lot of money to try to keep influence. So I'm actually fairly confident. Senator Bramble is known to be a good Senate sponsor, so I think we'll get it done. Thanks.
Thank you. Representative Roberts.
Thank you. I'll just end by maybe giving a little bit of insight in this, not necessarily endorsement one way or the other of the whole tax situation, but kind of where we come from and a little bit about the sponsor of the bill. For years we've been trying to deal with this issue one way or the other in our caucus meetings. Our fiscal analysts would come and show us, and they keep showing us this trend line, and we get pressure in our meetings every year to raise taxes here or there, and I've always been opposed to all these, and one of the guys who's always stood right there next to me or in front arguing that we should not be raising taxes, that we need to cut spending, we need to reduce spending, standing up in caucus meetings making all these arguments was Tim Quinn. He's always been that guy in that boat, arguing that direction. Do we have a revenue problem? We have a spending problem, right? And so we've been trying to cut spending, and he's been the guy making those arguments for years, just so everybody understands it. So yeah, there's certain people who run certain bills, and for me, when I see these people run these bills, I'm like, it's already a red flag for me. When Tim Quinn runs bills, I personally trust Representative Quinn. So he started diving into this thing. Last year, he and I were on a committee called Beal Business Economic Development, and you would be amazed at the stuff that gets funded out of that committee. And he and I, you're on that committee too, right? It's the three of us hated that committee. We just pull our hair out, and we fund year in year hot air balloon contests, dance company, treehouse museums, all kinds of stuff. And So just, Tim's always been on that side fighting to reduce spending, reduce spending, reduce spending. So he started diving into this thing, trying to figure out, hey, if we reduce spending, we've got this divergence in the general fund, we've got this issue in the constitutional requirement of the income tax. And I think through that process, he started seeing the structural issues. And I'm just guessing about how we got here, and Tim got here. But over the summer, that's how, I don't think he necessarily signed up for this or anybody nominated him, said, hey, Tim, you run this. But he's a smart guy and started diving into it and saw the structural issue here. And I asked him the other day, I said, hey, this convergence, and correct me if I get this wrong, this divergence, in this delta in growth of general fund, which for me, I want to stop the growth, right? We're growing so much, and the revenue going down, the trend of revenue going down. If we had funded anything out of our Beetle committee and took all that money, it still doesn't cover that delta. So we do have a structural problem. But I just want to give some insight on Tim. I know he's getting beat up all over the place on this, but that's where he comes from on it. And so for me, it gives me a little bit of assurance for the guy who's running it. And secondly, we've also been arguing for years when we get tax proposals coming to us. Good tax policy, and this is by all conservative fiscal think tanks across the country everywhere, say broaden the base, lower the rate on the sales tax, and then lower the rate on the income tax. And so that's, we've always been arguing for that. And so it's a bit hard now that that's what we've been arguing for. Hey, broaden the base, let's lower the rates. You know, so then when you really go and do it, and how do you do it indiscriminately to everybody? What does that base look like when you're really going to do it, instead of having all these carve-outs across everywhere? Then you get into VAT taxes and different things. But conservative policies, for tax policies, have always said, broaden the base, lower the rate, lower the income tax rate. That's what the proposal is, and that's the guy who's running it. So just want to put that out there, not necessarily for or against the whole idea, but where it's coming from, the policy ideas, and I think Tim has said all along, he wants a tax cut in all of this. And we're going to get more data on, we got the, and you saw there was a question up there, the average family. We're going to have more data. I know it's being worked on. What about the non-average families, right? What does this look like? And every year when we look at these things, there's always, whenever you fiddle with this thing, there's always winners and losers. But for me personally, I want to see, if we do this, Representative Quinn, a tax cut overall, right, for us if we're going to fix this structural issue. I'll just end with that. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Henderson.
Thank you. I want to echo a lot of the things that Representative Roberts just said. I've worked with Representative Quinn on the Revenue Taxation Committee for a number of years. I chaired the committee for 4 years, and Tim's always been on the right side of taxes, and I have a lot of trust in him. There are some things in the proposal that make me squirm just a little bit, and that I worry about. But we're on the edge of a fiscal cliff in our state, and we've got to fix it. And not fixing it means we're just kicking the can down the road, continuing to do that until we have a crisis. And we're fast approaching that crisis. We've got to do something. And I know that there are a lot of people, especially the lawyers, who don't like the idea of having their services taxed. But when we can broaden the base, we can lower the rate. And that is what good, sound, conservative tax policy is. It's a broad base and a low rate, government not picking winners and losers. So I really appreciate the work and the effort that Representative Quinn and others have gone to try to hit that mark. And there may be some changes and some other things that get put into it. But we've got to fix the crisis before it happens, because it's right at our door. Another thing that's happening in the Senate on Monday that I would love feedback on is we've got hate crimes legislation coming up on Monday in the Senate. It's the first time in many years that we've actually had a hearing, and we'll have a floor debate on this. Utah currently does have a hate crimes law, but it's not usable because it doesn't outline specific protected classes. This bill would outline specific protected classes, and just for an example, we all are members of many of those protected classes, right? We all have a gender, we all have a race, we all have a religion, we all have an age, and so the idea is if you're targeting somebody because of certain things, the crime is more, it's worse than if you're just targeting one person. If you're targeting a whole swath of people, a whole group of people to inflict terror on a whole group of people, then that's worse than just targeting one person. The other side of that is, why are we picking who those groups of people should be? And so there, you know, there's a lot of back and forth that's gone on about this issue, and I would appreciate feedback on that if anybody cares to weigh in. Thank you.
I just want to echo what's been said. I mean, Sue sat next to me on the House floor, and while I have many concerns, I don't have any concern with the intentions of the bill sponsor who's working on that. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Kevin and Scott and Nebo. I mean, this is fantastic. I'm glad we're here through the weather. We're going to stick around. I've been looking through all these questions. I'll stick around. I know we've got a lot of questions still, but thank you.
Thank you.
In fear that Representative Quinn's head might start rubbing on my shoulder, I'm not saying any more good things about him, other than just to say that he is a good friend and I love him very much. He's a good guy. And when it comes to conservative policy, he made mention about Utah. There's an organization that ranks states, and it's called a Rich State, Poor State Report. For 11 years in a row, the state of Utah has been #1 in tax policy. And it's based on more people pay, the lower the rate, the lower income tax rate. 11 years in a row, #1. That's every state in the union has been compared what their tax policy looks like. There's some individual policy within certain states that may be better than Utah. We may be better in some individual policies in other states, but as an aggregate, we've been #1 for 11 years in a row. It's not because of any special sauce that any of us do. It's because collectively, people before us have always been able to look forward and try to understand what's coming forward, what's going down the line. That will continue to be the case. I do know that this bill has got a lot of people in angst. Anytime we change something drastic, there are always lots of questions. There was a comment about 9 days. Is that enough time? This has been worked on for a long time. It just so happens that we do lots of things. We balance $14 billion in a 45-day session. Do you know that the implementation date on this is going to be delayed? If we need to come back and adjust it, we will after more study there as well. There's a question that says, as our population continues to grow, will we increase our number of legislators to keep representation per citizen responsible? There will be a new census taken in 2020. Based on where the population is, the number of legislators will not change, but there will be more legislators in those areas where there's more population. Utah County will have more representation. They'll have more influence and more spots in the legislative seat after this 2020 census. So that will continue to grow. 9 days left, lots of things going on. This is where a lot of things are funded or looked at, funding priorities that are out there. I appreciate you guys being here. I'll stick around for a few minutes as well. And thanks again for everyone that puts this on. Last one for this year. We'll come back again and do it next year again. So thank you.
Thank you. Representative Quinn, final comments?
Thank you. And again, thank you for Francis, for Representative Gibson for inviting me and you allowing me to say a few things about this tax bill. And thank you for, I did pay them, but I didn't know they were going to carry through with what they said they would about saying nice things about me. But if I could just, there's one up there that I did fail to mention, and that is the local option portion of the sales tax. There's several components to the local option, a 1% that everybody participates in, a quarter that everybody participates in, and then what we call boutique taxes, where it varies from municipality to municipality, county to county. That portion of it, the boutiques, will be dropped commensurately with the overall sales tax rate. The 1 1/4 will be left alone. The local options will be held harmless. There's a restricted account, not only for two accounting methods, one for the state and one for the locals, where we bring that money in We know that there's winners and losers. Salt Lake has all of the services, and Syracuse and Riverdale. Riverdale's a very car-oriented sales economy. They will have their revenues drop. So this account's being set up so we return to the cities everything that they were getting in the previous year with a calculation from population and CPI, type of population and CPI. So there is a hold harmless for cities. We need a couple of years to look at the data, see who was a winner, who was a loser, and then formulate a statutory language that we don't need to have that restrict the county to perpetuity, but it will allow cities to be held harmless. So that is a concern of ours, and we've tried to make sure that the language is appropriate to make sure cities do not receive extra benefit, and certainly that they're not harmed through this policy. But again, thank you, and thank you to all my colleagues. It is we do a lot of hard stuff. Because of my district, I tell people I represent Texas and San Francisco. And sometimes you gotta have a thick skin to work up here, and it would not be worth it if it were not for the people that I work with, even those that I disagree with ideology, on an ideology basis. So I appreciate and respect everyone up here. So thank you this morning for letting us be here.
Great, thank you. We're out of time. Please join me in thanking our legislators for their time this morning and being here.